I made that joke. We did Martin Luther, and then we did the Reformation, and then we've just finished Islam. So you made that joke. It was a perfectly good joke. We haven't cracked a Bible in Bible study, which is actually true. We crack it open from time to time, but now we're into Ezekiel, and I would love to do a New Testament book, maybe following close on the heels of this. So I want to say a few things kind of from the intro here and just talk our way through it, and then we'll get to the first lesson. So the books of the prophets are not widely read by Christians. They're very hard to read. They're very difficult to get through. I've taught classes on Ezekiel and Jeremiah. Those have been good classes. A lot of the material that I'm going to present in the lessons, I've translated chunks of it from the Hebrew, using a number of commentaries and then my own work. So we'll talk about that as it arises. But I got a map up here, and then I've got some dates. These dates are tentative. 623 is a typical date for maybe the time when Ezekiel was born. We don't really know when he died. Sometime probably after 570. And so we're going to set him in his historic context. He was a priest. He lived in the environs of Jerusalem. And the first 30 years of his life, so to speak, he was there in Jerusalem. And then Nebuchadnezzar, who was the power at the time, eventually began taking exiles into Babylon, and he went with them. And then at that point, he became involved in his prophetic ministry, and that's where the book Ezekiel in the Old Testament begins. I'm just going to go ahead and open up to it here. If like Doug, you want to call him Zeke, you can call him Zeke.
Yeah, I want to make a class proposal. Can we refer to him as Zeke?
You are allowed to refer to him as Zeke.
Like everyone to do that.
If you wanted to say it in Hebrew, it sounds very close to Yehezkel. And Hebrew words don't pass into English easy. We pretty much mutilate them. Ezekiel is the name we're used to. The main issue in Ezekiel's time is whether or not the God, the creator of the universe, had indeed created Israel and called Israel to be his special people. These events of being conquered by Assyria and Babylonia, most of these other nations they vanish from the historical record. We read about them, but they lost their identity as a people. They lost their identity. But Israel remained strong. Israel's still there today. And the main question, if the God of the universe did indeed call us, then why are these things happening? What exactly is the economy of his providence saying here? A lot of people lost their faith. It isn't just that they were tortured or killed or lost their families or their homes or their livelihood. That happened to all of these ancient peoples. But in ancient Israel, many of them did lose their faith. The prophets were stubbornly, they were stubborn. They believed the story of Israel, and they stuck with it. And the beauty is that their writings survive, and that much of what they said came to pass. And so we still have these writings, and they're a testimony on the one hand for us as Christians as to God's faithfulness to his people, but they're also testimonies to the faith of the ancient prophets of Israel in the face of incredible circumstances that just never died, and they never stopped believing. So Ezekiel's ministry took place when he was in a little Jewish settlement at Tel Aviv, not modern-day Tel Aviv, somewhat different place by the same name, ancient times. Began in 593 and lasted to 571. So I'll put that up here. His ministry (593 to 571). So the whole book of Ezekiel emerges during those years. He was born earlier than that, and he died after that. But that's what the material in the book comes from.
Janet?
Yeah.
Quick question. Babylonia had laid siege to Israel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the siege where they were actually eating their children?
Yes.
So,
There were several of them.
so I could see how they lost their faith. I mean,
Siege warfare. The warfare in the ancient world is pretty brutal. And siege warfare resulted, as poverty still does today, a sort of doorway into every other conceivable vice of which human beings are capable. Betrayal, cannibalism, the worst of the worst.
But God had said in Deuteronomy this would happen.
Yes. And in many ways, the book of Deuteronomy anticipates these things and talks about them in its lists of curses. Eventually, Ezekiel's prophecies that were presented within this time frame, they would have been gathered, they would have been organized, and edited into a book that we currently have. There are three big books in the Old Testament. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel are called the major prophets. And what they mean by major is that these are big books. We do have the minor prophets, like Hosea and Amos and so forth. In the old copies, they were simply collected they're so short. Obadiah takes up like half a page. That they were collected on a single scroll and called the minor prophets. And there were 12 of them. So as far as the prophets in the Old Testament go, we got three big books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and then the book of the 12. Daniel is sort of inserted in there, but Daniel is usually thought of by even modern scholars as a little different because it has a lot of apocalyptic material in it, the final confrontation between good and evil. And so Daniel is considered technically an apocalypse, sort of like the book of Revelation is for the New Testament. And I think they're doing Daniel in the Baptist church, so you get a little bit.
In the Baptist church.
Yeah, the Baptist church is doing Daniel. I did Daniel years and years ago, and so that's considered an apocalypse. As far as the organization of the book, Ezekiel dates his oracles, day, month, and year, in a way that the other prophets don't generally. And that is interesting. In the such and such month of the such and such day of the such and such year, the word of the Lord came to me. That makes the arranging of this book far easier than any book that I've looked at. Over the past month and a half or so, I've been working on these lessons, and it's kind of nice. Jeremiah is a massive book, and it's a mess. And I loved sorting through it, but to try to put things in their proper historical chronology, I found difficult. And I often had to make sort of judgment calls when I was teaching Jeremiah and then footnote them so that nobody thought that I was some sort of know-it-all who was the final authority on when these things occurred, because I'm not. Ezekiel is a little bit easier. So I mention here chapters 1 through 24 are oracles of judgment against his own nation, Israel. 25 to 32, oracles against foreign powers. And then 33 to 48 are oracles concerning salvation or hope. So that threefold division of the book is fairly standard. The only full copy of the book of Ezekiel is the Masoretic text, and that is a Hebrew text that goes way, way back, but the most recent version of it in our possession is from the Middle Ages. Most of our Old Testaments come from the Masoretic text. We do have a copy of Ezekiel from the Dead Sea Scrolls. I was talking about this last week, but we cannot open it. It is very, very difficult to open these scrolls without destroying them. And I mentioned a movie I grew up watching, The Time Machine. Who's the actor in that?
Rod Robert.
Yeah, Rod. There's a scene where he's he pulls these books down and they crumble into dust in his hands. And I always remember that scene in the movie growing up, and it just makes him so angry because all this knowledge just fell out on the floor, and there's no way to recover it. So the Dead Sea Scrolls have Ezekiel, but we can't read it. And it takes a very time-consuming process using chemicals and puzzling these scrolls back together to open them, and Ezekiel can't be opened. So that text is our oldest. We have translations into Greek, Syriac, Aramaic. We have Jerome's Latin Vulgate, and sometimes those preserve old readings that might go back to the original. And so I might include footnotes about that. And we'll deal with it as we encounter it. You know, when we get a book like this between two tidy covers, all in translation, a lot has happened before this comes into our hands. You know, and it's beautiful to have it, but we just need to be aware of that. You know, it didn't drop out of the heavens one day. There it is, the ESV. Thank you. It's a little more complicated than that. What's that? Yeah, it didn't come off of gold plates found in America from the lost 10 tribes of Israel, who are the ancestors of the Native Americans. I'm a man of religious faith, but that even is a bit much for me. So, the Jewish canon, Ezekiel very early made it into the Jewish canon. Christians have followed suit. As always with any book of the Bible, there are evidences of later editorial hands. And we'll have to talk about those as they occur in the text. You have what Ezekiel wrote, you have how it was handed down, and then you have what later editors did when they compiled it and put it into a book. And so always scholars are going to wrestle with this idea of how much of Ezekiel goes back to the prophet himself in his own time, in his own words, and how much has been influenced by later people who were charged with preserving what he said, and as it has come down. Most famous passages of the Bible, a great many come from Ezekiel, his vision of the fiery chariot, to the valley of dry bones, to Gog and Magog, to his vision of the temple. And so he's one of the great prophets of the Old Testament. And I like priestly stuff. So there's my introduction to who he is, when he lived, how the material was handed down, and the rest is all in the footnotes. If you know me, I like to write lengthy footnotes. And as people have told me over the years, the most interesting part of your lessons. So I'm excited about this. Today's class, we'll see how far we get through this lesson. And if at any time you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll jump in. I really want to do the historical setting, because when we pick up in Ezekiel chapter 1, a lot of things are going on. And we won't understand what he's talking about if we don't know the setting. The Iron Age is what archaeologists sometimes call Iron Age 2. Beginning at about 1000 BC to the Roman Empire, is one of the most important periods in world history, because now, for the first time, you have the development of civilizations that have the technology to conquer the civilized world. Now, the key word there is civilized. They don't have the power to conquer the globe. But outside the Middle East, this fairly represents the world of civilization, of cities, of writing, of higher technology. Once you get beyond this range, of course, you have the Germans up here are still living in tents and riding horses, and they're not leaving written documents. So you have pre-civilized groups. But during Iron Age 2, following roughly in this order, first Assyria, then Babylonia, then Persia, and then, pause, now we move to the west. Greece, and of course, Rome. And it's sort of a story of the bigger fish eating the smaller fish, but this is the most important series of events and the ones with which the ancient world closes. The rise of these vast world empires that conquer through their ideology of might is right and through their incredible military power, so that by the time we get to the New Testament, Rome is the Empire of Rome is all the way from the Atlantic Ocean in the west, and they're conducting trade with China in the east. Massive empire.
During Ezekiel, would that be Alexander, or who would be?
So, Ezekiel's time is Babylon.
So it's Nebuchadnezzar's.
So he falls right here. Ezekiel, when he was born, about 623, is very close to the time of the fall of Nineveh and the collapse of Assyria. So that's over. Assyria's over. Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, is an incredibly talented warlord, is conquering Assyria and spreading Babylonian power throughout the Middle East. And Ezekiel will die before the rise of Persia. So within this 5-empire scheme, Ezekiel will fall well within the range of Babylon. That's a good question. Because, if we're reading the New Testament, we're dealing with Rome. If you read your apocryphal books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, you're during the Greek period, time of Alexander the Great. Our Old Testament, our Protestant Old Testament, fairly ends in the Persian period. And whether you're Roman Catholic or not, reading the apocryphal literature is helpful from a historical point of view because it just gives you the whole history. But Assyria, which I'm going to talk about today, is the first empire to really set out to conquer the civilized world. Other empires had existed before Assyria, but they didn't even have it in their ability to do what Assyria did. So Assyria is the first, and each empire gets slightly bigger than the last until you get to Rome. And Rome is, of course, the greatest, in the sense of most influential. There were a lot of things about Rome that weren't great. So the two oldest empires in the world, of course, are Egypt and then Mesopotamia. The original inhabitants of Mesopotamia were the Sumerians. I always remember studying them in school, because anytime we had a history class, the teacher always began with Sumer, and then we got bogged down somewhere, and we never got to the 20th century. It was just so dull. And so I learned about the invention of writing in the wheel so many times. And I wouldn't mind have gotten to World War II or something, somewhat interesting. But they always began with Sumer. We don't know who the Sumerians were. Their language is what's called an isolate. It's not related to any other known language. It's just really, really old. But eventually they were conquered by a group called the Akkadians. And then the Akkadians divided into a northern group and a southern group. And the northern group was called the Assyrians. The southern group was called the Babylonians. And they're Semitic, which means that they're related to the Jews by language and culture and ethnicity. Tiglath-Pileser III is an Akkadian who conquered the land of Mesopotamia. Oh, I mentioned the Akkadians did. Oh, no. I want to skip down to the bottom. You have page numbers on your lessons? So it starts on what? Page 5? Okay, so Tiglath-Pileser III is the guy I want to get to today. Last line on page 5, and then I'll go over to page 6. He's the first that sets the what's called the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and I'll even write that up here, the Neo-Assyrian Empire into motion. And that starts in about the 8th century. I'll say the 10th, the 8th, and then finally it collapses in the 7th century. The ideology of the ancient civilizations is basically might is right. Whoever is the more powerful civilization, their gods are superior. You even find this in books like 1st and 2nd Samuel. One people group conquers another people group. The first thing they do is take the idols of the people that they conquer and put them in the temple of their deity. And it's a way of saying, ha-ha, we're better than you, we're stronger than you, our gods are more powerful than you. Of course, the Israelites did not have an idol. They had an Ark of a Covenant, though, so that was about the best thing that they got. And the biblical writers are they have a lot of fun with that in 1 Samuel, because when the Philistines capture the Ark, you know the story, it creates problems for them. And then they have to give it back. But that's an ancient practice. And this is very, very widespread. And so one of the problems for the Israelites is if they're being conquered by foreign peoples, it sends most people the message that their God is inferior. Yahweh's an inferior deity. So that is the ideology of the time. However, for Assyria, they have a few things that other people did not have up to that point. They're creating international roads so they can travel. They have coined money, so their economy is very, very powerful. And they have standing armies that are ready to fight all year long. Siege weapons to break down walls, and iron, which can cut through older forms of metal very, very quickly. Most of these other Middle Eastern empires simply crumble and fall in the face of the Assyrian onslaught. Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, Aram, Phoenicia, Phrygia, and I'll put Lydia over here on the coast. And let's put Edom down here. And let's put Moab over here. And Ammon up here. My map is getting full. You have Arabs in the south. So this is the first we begin to hear about Arabs in the historical record. They are not yet Muslims. That will not happen for about 1,000 years. So they're just pagans like everybody else. The Scythians are the sort of horsemen that run along the Eurasian steppe lands up in the north, and they traffic between the Middle East and the Orient. Very, very powerful, fierce warriors. But one of the things that this does, I'll talk about the effect that it has on Greece and some of these other nations, and then I'll talk about the effect that it has on Israel. It's interesting, during this Iron Age period, Karl Jaspers often called this the axial age. With the spread of these world empires, you have two developments that happen at the same time. You have human-centered religion in the Orient, and then, that's in the Orient or in the East, you have philosophy and democracy in the West. And those happen very much around the same time. This is sometimes called the axial age because it's not just that these world empires begin building and tormenting nations around them. For most of human history, people were polytheists. They believed in a lot of different deities. They built temples. They put idols in their temples. They performed the practices that we see in the Old Testament. But in the West, in Greece, you have the development of a very high sense of human freedom, a very high sense of human value, critical investigation into ideas that have been handed down for centuries. Anaxagoras in Athens will be one of the first to suggest that the sun is not a deity, but that it is a very, very hot rock in the sky, and he'll have to flee his homeland for having said that, because you can get killed for saying things like that. And then in the East, you have religions like Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, all which are very based on not worship of nature, but on man and man's position in the world. And so while these imperial nations are spreading, there's a worldview shift that is taking place in the world, and it's still with us today. Most of the major religions of the world that are still alive today come from this time period. So this is a very, very important period in the history of the ancient world.
This Falun Gong, is that more of a Taoist type? You've heard of them, right? Falun Gong.
What's the first thing you said there?
Falun Gong.
Okay.
Falungo.
Okay. I was thinking of Lao Tzu, who's the founder of the Taoist religion. I'm not sure that particular name I'm not familiar with.
They're more contemporary. Yeah, they're persecuted. They're founders still alive.
If they're Taoists, yeah, they would trace their history back to this time period.
Yeah. They're persecuted by the Chinese.
So what we have here, I don't know the contemporary person that you mentioned there, but if it's Taoism, then it comes from this time period. Now I'm going to get to ancient Israel, and we're going to talk about her history up to the time of Ezekiel. But it is important to understand that the political and military spread of these empires produces, or at least coincides with, a major shift in human thinking about religion. And that'll be true in in ancient Israel too. So Ezekiel's living at a very, very interesting time in human history. This is probably the most important event in the ancient world next to the birth of Jesus. I would say is this time with the spread of these empires and mankind's shift across cultures, India, China, Persia, Greece, the Middle East, everywhere, mankind is moving into a very, very different way of thinking about the world. And historians don't know why these two things coincide. There's theories, but nobody can really verify them. So where I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up today over on page 567 and just talk about ancient Israel. But before I do that, I want to see if there's any questions about the spread of these empires and this kind of shift in human worldview. Yeah.
Just a quick question. Where was Egypt in all this? Was Egypt fading as an empire by this time?
Two things I'll say about Egypt. Egypt is entering her twilight as a great world power. She has been an empire, but she's never been able to spread too much beyond the Nile River. The Nile River is so essential to her own way of thinking. And she continues to vie for control of this part of the world, particularly ancient Israel. But she doesn't have the dynamic power of Assyria and Babylonia to just spread beyond her own borders. So politically, Egypt is still a reputable, what's the word I'm looking for? You know when they make you Professor Emeritus, you know your days are numbered? Egypt is Empire Emeritus on the map. Very important to Israel because Israel wants her to back them up. But she can't spread that much. Her way of life, and her way of life is so tied to the land and the river and tradition that religiously speaking, she's very wed to the polytheism of the old days. And so Egypt's time is over. She was the queen of civilizations and will go down in history as the longest lasting civilization, 3,000 years. People say America's an old nation. We've been around for what, 200 years? 3,000's pretty good. That's a long, long time. But she's part of the way the world used to be. Yeah.
Egypt's empire ends officially at the Battle of Carchemish then?
I don't know if you could say the empire officially ends at the Battle of Carchemish. We'll talk about that today. What does happen at the Battle of Carchemish, though, is she retreats within her borders, and she never engages in any further imperial ambition after that. So she still exists. Yeah. Usually Egypt's downfall is officially dated to the Antony and Cleopatra in the Roman period. And at that point, she's done. She's done.
How much of an influence was Judaism during this time period? I mean, did that religion spread to these other cultures too?
Good question. Not much. Not much. To read from contemporary documents in ancient Greece, they are hardly aware of Jews. You don't find in Plato or the playwrights or Socrates or the pre-Socratics almost any knowledge of Judaism. The Egyptians know of them. And these empires that conquer know of them. Probably the ones who know of them most are these local, Edom, Moab, Ammon, Aram. They know a little bit about Yahweh. We have documents from those civilizations that mention the divine name. At the very least, they know that Yahweh is the God of Israel. But that's an important question, because one of the major issues is that part of Israel's mandate in the book of Exodus is to be a kingdom of priests and to bring faith in Yahweh to other nations. It doesn't look like that's happening a great deal.
But Nebuchadnezzar really became a believer, didn't he? Or didn't he?
Well, whether he became a believer or not, the book of Daniel suggests that he had a powerful experience of Yahweh's sovereignty. And he did come to acknowledge the God Yahweh. And so there are isolated incidences in other cultures where Yahweh does receive some acknowledgement from foreign rulers. Daniel, particular case in point.
That's interesting.
It is interesting.
Think about it. I mean,
We don't have anything corroborating, though we do have in the Babylonian Chronicle, I'll probably throw it in a footnote, an indication that there was a season when Nebuchadnezzar went into a time of mental instability. And that has echoes, in the book of Daniel. So, how does all this affect Israel? How does all this affect Israel? Picking up on page 5, 6, 7. In the 8th century, particularly, that's when Tiglath-Pileser III begins. Now, Ashur-Dan, an earlier Assyrian emperor in the 10th century, begins its expansive project. In the 8th century, though, Assyria begins to hit Israel and is a real threat. And that's when we get the major prophets of the Old Testament: Micah, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah. And these prophets are a little bit different than, say, Elijah or Elisha. They are sometimes called the writing prophets. They produce literature. And they're not like in the days of Samuel going out looking for people's lost donkeys. They're talking about international affairs. And they're discussing Yahweh on an international scale. The major theme of the 8th century prophets is this idea of the day of the Lord. So I'll write in Israel, we have what are sometimes called the 8th century prophets. And their major theme is the day of Yahweh, or the day of the Lord. Now, that'd be of interest to anybody in the philosophy of religion or the problem of, say, evil. People always ask the question, well, there's all this evil in the world. Why doesn't God do something? Why doesn't he, if I'm downtown Detroit and I'm walking by an alley and I see somebody being abused or harmed, I feel that I have a moral obligation, hopefully, to do something. And so then the question is, well, why doesn't God do something? He sees evil things happening. Why shouldn't he do something? The 8th century prophets begin saying, well, he's going to. But he's eternal, and he has set a day when he is going to actually intervene in history, and he's going to do what? Well, he's going to punish the wicked. He's going to uphold the righteous. And that's going to happen on the great and terrible day of the Lord. And that becomes a repeated theme in Micah, Isaiah, Hosea, and Amos. And it's interesting that it happens during this time period, with the spread of these great empires, the shift in sort of human worldview thinking, and now in ancient Israel, prophets talking about the day of the Lord. The earliest 8th century prophets are Amos, Hosea, and Micah. That's 3 of our minor prophets. And of course, the greatest is Isaiah, Isaiah the prophet. And those lived during the time of the Assyrian expansion. And a major part of the day of the Lord is calling Israel back to covenant. You get the idea that a lot of Israelites are a little salty, they're a little cynical, they're losing their faith in God. They don't really know if they believe all of this stuff anymore. And the prophets are calling them back and saying, well, you better decide now because the day is coming. And when the day comes, it's not going to do after the war is over to lay your rifle down and then choose sides depending on who wins the battle. If the Germans win, you can't say, well, we were with them all along. We just decided about 5 minutes ago. That's not going to work. So you can think of the prophets, having the sign, the end is near. Repent, the end is near. And of course that for New Testament readers, it sounds like John the Baptist. John the Baptist is in many ways an Old Testament prophet, preaching a very, very similar message. So jump on over to page 8, and this is where I want to pick up today. Political history of Israel. Today, what do I got? 15 minutes? Let's see. Might even get through the whole history of Israel in 15 minutes. I doubt it.
You did cover 5 centuries, like a few weeks ago, so this is nothing.
We got to get to Ezekiel quick. But before I do, so basically I've hit 3 things. We've got these empires, we've got this religious shift, and this is what's happening in ancient Israel. Any questions or comments before I dump another bucket of information over your head?
Just a comment. I'm just flabbergasted how great God is. I mean, here he's minimized by all these nations, and yet he's the great God of heaven and earth. It's just amazing to me that he can be so ignored and only
He
contained in this.
paints on a big canvas.
Yeah,
I do think these things are important because a lot of times we have difficulty getting into these old books, and some of it is because we don't know all that much about ancient history, not most of us. For Ezekiel, these things are on the forefront of his mind. He's living through them. And so we have to work a little bit to sort of get into the place where he found himself. But he and Isaiah and Jeremiah were certainly living in the midst of big, big events. And they knew it. They knew it. So the nation of Israel, there's a lot of dispute about when this event occurs. I generally place the Exodus in the 13th century BC. But if you ask another Bible scholar, they'll kick it back a few hundred years, maybe, to the 15th century BC. But about that time, you have the story of Israel coming up out of Egypt. This is the Sinai Peninsula, and so that's where they will receive the Torah, and they'll build the tabernacle, and they'll take a census and organize themselves as an army. 40 years the Bible gives before they actually invade the land of Canaan and then engage in several centuries worth of warfare trying to take that over. Now, if you read the book of Joshua, you kind of get the idea that the ancient Israelites came in and just sort of wiped everybody out. But the book of Joshua is really tricky the way it reads. One verse will say, Joshua and the Israelites conquered the whole land. And then the next verse will say something like, the Lord said, there is still land to be taken. I just thought you conquered it all. And so when you get to the book of Judges, you get the idea that the Israelites are struggling considerably. There's a lot of Canaanite enclaves who are hassling them on a generational basis, whether it's the Moabites or whether it's the Arameans. And so they're struggling to take over this part of the land. But it's good to know that after these many thousands of years that there is peace in Israel and that there's no longer warfare going on there. Ha ha ha. The people of Israel really decide that in order to clinch the deal, they need to run affairs the way the other nations are running them. They need a king. And maybe you know, if you've read Samuel, that Samuel the prophet doesn't like that idea. But they do get a king. And so for a season, you have a united Israel. Saul, from the tribe of Benjamin, is Israel's first king. He builds a palace in the city of Gibeah. He's the first to collect taxes. He's the first to raise armies to fight against particularly the Ammonites, other people that the Israelites are fighting against. But Saul is, I don't know. What is the problem with Saul? He doesn't end well. He has no faith.
He's fearful.
He is afraid of the people. He makes a couple mistakes, particularly. He usurps the privileges of the priesthood, for which Samuel chastises him. He also takes plunder in war, which he's not supposed to do. So he doesn't really get a dynasty. His son, to follow him, would have been Jonathan. Jonathan technically would have been the next king of Israel. Jonathan is close friends with David, who Saul is terrified of, because he suspects that David has designs on the kingship, and he's not wrong. And everything that he does doesn't work. David ends up becoming friends with his son. David is popular with the people. David is married to one of his daughters. David's just better. That's the old story. Well, maybe you've been in a business. Anybody ever been in a business or an institution with an insecure leader who somehow has been put in charge of someone who is better than them?
I was the insecure leader. That's not real.
Okay. This is an old story of a person who has the official title of authority. Think of Agamemnon and Achilles. I don't know. Pick a story. Who is rattled by the fact that they are officially in charge over someone who they know is going to take over at some point. So David becomes the next king, and of course from that point forward, the tribe of Judah will be the tribe through whom the kings of Jerusalem are reckoned. David moves the capital to Jerusalem. He's a very successful warrior. He's a very pious man. I always say, like a lot of people in history, David is incredibly successful in public life, but his private life stinks. He fails as a husband, as a father, as a manager of his own private affairs. And you read about in the Bible the catastrophes that beset his household. But it doesn't mean God doesn't love him, and it doesn't mean that he doesn't do great things for Israel. He is a very, very successful public man. But his private life is a catastrophe. So,
God for grace.
yeah. I mean, isn't it even true today that often public figures, politicians, and leaders have private lives that are a wreck? No. And it doesn't mean that they're not publicly successful. And I always struggle with that. There's just sort of a side note, we live in a culture now where if a leader's private life is a wreck, then we become very morally judgmental. And we say, well, we're going to boycott that person. We're not going to have anything to do with that person. I don't know that I agree with that. If a public leader within politics or the church had been found guilty of adultery and soliciting the murder of somebody who is very close to them, the cry would be, well, we can no longer read the Psalms. I am still going to read the Psalms. Just because David fell into sin, it's not like, well, I'm going to boycott the Psalms. We're not going to read those. He's a bad, bad guy. It's like, well, no. He's a human being. And so David really, I think it's good that we have his story in the Bible. And nobody can say that these stories were made up, because who would make up such a story? This is what in law they call an admission against interest. You don't make up stories to tell everybody how awful you are. So these are valuable stories, and I think it's an important time for us as Christians to remember this, because we have a lot of leaders who are failing on the right and on the left, and they're doing this, that, and the next thing. The temptation is very great to assume a posture of moral superiority. Say, well, we will have nothing to do with those people. But our own Bible, I think, advises us against this. So anyways, David is a great, great character.
Isn't that, I think I've read this somewhere, isn't that something somewhat unique about Israel and about the Bible? The fact that it shows the leaders such flaws?
I don't find it in almost any other ancient literature I read.
Josephus whitewashed a lot of stuff too.
What's that?
Josephus whitewashed a lot of stuff.
He did.
A lot of the kings in ancient times were portrayed as, just lived unblemished lives and were heroic and Superman almost.
Yes, I mean, the stories about David in the Old Testament cannot be propaganda. Nobody writes that kind of propaganda. So, yes, I don't find it in a lot of other literature. And that's important, The nation of Israel's historical national literature is self-critical. And you don't find that in most nations, in most peoples. So we do have a treasure in the story of David. We're not going to get too far past him today, so what I'm going to do here is this lesson is kind of intro, catching us up to Ezekiel. What I want to do then is, after David, I'll say a few things about that. We've got the Exodus. We've got the conquest of the land. We have the united monarchy under Saul, David, and Solomon. And probably a good place to pick up next week is the division of the monarchy. And the nation's going to divide into a southern nation, which calls itself Judah, from which we get the word Jew, and a northern nation called Israel. The northern nation will fall in 722 to the Assyrians. The southern nation will fall in 586 to the Babylonians, and that'll bring us to Ezekiel. And so what we'll have to do next week, I'll print up the next following lesson, which is a little bit longer than this one, and we'll talk about the fall of northern Israel and then the early life of Ezekiel and the rise of the Assyrian Empire as it continues its march this direction. All of this stuff plays a huge role in Ezekiel's writings. He talks about the Exodus and about the history of the nation. He's clearly a well-educated priest. He's probably one of the most educated people living in his time. Let me stop a moment and see if there's anything else I want to... So, let me see if there's any final questions or comments. We have kind of a general introduction to the time period, the sort of global events going on, what's going on in Israel and its history leading up to. I didn't get to the Battle of Carchemish. Carchemish. I don't know how it's pronounced. I don't know how it's pronounced. All right, let me...
During this time, does Israel disappear?
Northern nation of Israel?
Yeah.
So, in 722, when the Assyrians are still in power, probably right about here, the northern nation of Israel does disappear. The first exile takes place northeast of in a place called Galilee, of all places. It's inconceivable why Jesus would begin his ministry there. So, yes. And then all that remains is Judah. Judah struggles during that time period. The king's always trying to strike a deal with Egypt to protect them against Assyria, and prophets like Isaiah castigating the kings for engaging in political machinations rather than putting their faith in Yahweh. Of course, the position of the kings is that religious faith is great and everything. You know, it's awfully sweet, especially around the fireplace, but we need men and troops. This is reality we're talking about here. Of course, Isaiah, one of the reasons why he probably goes down in the canon is because he famously predicts, when all hope is lost, that the Assyrian army will be wiped out, and it is wiped out. And then everybody's like, oh, maybe. And so at that point, whether he got lucky or whatever happened, at that point, as they say, they knew that a prophet had been among them. And then Isaiah will live within that fame for the rest of his life. But basically, it's politics versus religion. You know, in whom is Israel going to put their trust? Northern Israel falls, and I'll put Judah down there because by the time we get to Ezekiel, Judah is pretty much what we're talking about. And that's the southern nation there. All right. I got to let you go. There's food downstairs. We'll continue next week. Thank you.